The night Tara Grinstead vanished, Ocilla, Georgia felt its heartbeat change as a white Honda sat unmoved in a driveway. A phone glowed on a kitchen counter, and a locked door guarded a silence that no one could explain. For years the community marched through forests and along riverbanks, gathered beneath candlelight and lived inside a question that refused to fade, until a confession in 2017 led investigators to a former student and to a pecan orchard where fire had tried to bury the truth. Answers arrived with edges, forcing neighbors to reconsider familiar faces and accept that the explanation had been close all along. This is the journey of a teacher who championed her students, a town that stood shoulder to shoulder through seasons of uncertainty, and a case that traveled from rumor to courtroom to a final memorial that closed a chapter without easing the ache. What happened between the applause at the Sweet Potato Festival pageant and the morning a phone blinked unanswered in a quiet kitchen? How did a confession, a burn site on family land, and years of legal delays reshape the meaning of justice for an entire county? If you want to uncover these answers, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and make sure you turn on the bell icon for upcoming episodes. Tell me from which city you are watching this cold case story, and help this episode reach 5,000 likes. 17 years measure more than time. They measure students growing into parents, prayer lists rewritten again and again, and a classroom where a plaque fixed the past to the present. Ocilla learned to endure with organized searches, tip lines, and steady resolve, while national cameras came and went, and a podcast revived old names and new leads. Pressure gathered, and in February 2017, a long-locked door finally yielded when a former student spoke, pointing toward a hidden clearing beneath pecan branches. From that moment, the town carried two timelines at once: the October weekend in 2005 when Tara disappeared, and the careful march toward court, where memory, motive, and responsibility would be tested under oath. Stay with me as we begin at the very start. The last ordinary evening when Tara did what she loved most, lifting young people toward confidence and possibility. The auditorium felt bright and warm, a small world of lights and soft music inside Irwin County High School. Dresses rustled, judges whispered, families leaned forward in their seats. At the front, Tara Grinstead sat with a planner on her lap and a calm focus that steadied nervous hands backstage. She had spent weeks guiding these young women through posture and pacing, and how to breathe when the heart starts to race. She believed that poise could be taught and that courage could be practiced one careful step at a time. Backstage, a row of girls waited for their names. Tara moved from one to the next with quiet instructions and quick fixes. A loose strap, a stray curl, a last bit of encouragement. Shoulders back, chin level. Find the first friendly face in the crowd and walk toward it. Her voice never rose. Her presence did the work. When the final walk came, the room held a single hush. The crown was placed. Hannah Morris stood under the lights, teary and breathless, and the applause rolled across the seats like a wave. Tara clapped harder than anyone. She had watched Hannah fight through doubt and stumbles and learn how to steady herself on that stage. Coach and student met at the edge of the curtain. Hannah leaned in. "Thank you for seeing what I could not see yet." Tara smiled with pride that showed in her eyes more than on her face. "You earned every step." As families gathered for photographs, Tara helped collect garment bags and make sure no one left a shoe or a sash behind. She stacked programs, folded a few chairs, then checked her watch. A colleague asked about the cookout afterward, a friendly invitation that would keep the celebration going. Tara weighed the week in her mind. Lesson plans waited on her desk. Papers needed to be graded. The last few days had been long, filled with late practice sessions and early mornings. She chose the quiet road. She hugged students at the exit. She told them to rest and drink water and write down what they had learned while it was still fresh. She promised to talk through feedback on Monday, and to keep working with anyone headed to the next level. The girls drifted out into the cool October air, crowns and bouquets held close, parents calling for one more photo near the steps. Tara paused at the doorway and took in the emptied rows. The stage now still. The glow of the exit signs like small anchors in the dim. Outside, the parking lot seemed larger after a long night. Tara walked to her white Honda and set her planner on the passenger seat. The town around her felt small and familiar, as if every street knew her schedule and every porch light knew her name. She started the engine. She thought about the students who had trusted her, and the ones she still hoped to reach. She thought about rest in the calm of her own kitchen. She turned the car toward home. At the house on West Highway 319, there would be a brief exhale, a set of keys on a hook, a phone on a charger, a plan to sleep and start again. A good teacher's kind of evening, simple and earned. The sort of night no one marks on a calendar, because it feels ordinary and safe. A locked door will stand quietly while a phone light blinks on the counter. The road home was short and familiar. A quiet stretch where porch lights floated like small islands. Tara turned into the driveway at 300 West Highway 319 and let the engine settle. The house waited the way it always did, ordinary and calm. She stepped out with the soft ache of a long day in her legs, locked the car, and climbed the front steps with her planner tucked under one arm. The key turned. The door gave its gentle click. Warm air and faint detergent greeted her as she crossed the threshold. Purse on the kitchen counter. Keys on the hook by the door. Phone connected to its charger. The screen briefly bright and then still. She loosened a hair tie, set her planner by the fruit bowl and slipped off her shoes. A glass of water, a slow breath. The kind of simple sequence that makes a place feel safe. She checked the mail she had left earlier in the week and set aside a flyer about a school fundraiser. She glanced at Monday's lesson outline, already printed and clipped together, and smiled at the tidy list of objectives. The living room felt peaceful in the late hour. She folded a throw over the arm of the couch and moved through the rooms in a light routine. A small load of laundry ready for tomorrow. A note to herself about a quiz retake for a student who needed another chance. A reminder to order more pageant practice pins before the next season. She changed into soft clothes, gathered her hair again, and let the quiet fill the house. There were hopes she carried that did not fit on checklists. A thought of marriage that returned in gentle waves. A vision of a table set for more than one. A belief that the same patience she taught on stage could guide a life off stage. She had time, she told herself. She had work that mattered and young people who looked for her in the mornings. She had a sister who called on Sundays and friends who expected her at church. She had a calendar full of things that built toward something steady. The bedroom held the soft order of a teacher's weekend. Lesson plans stacked on the desk. A book open to the middle. A window cracked for a line of cool October air that moved the curtain now and then. She straightened the comforter, checked the alarm, and placed the planner within easy reach for morning review. The phone charged in the kitchen where she could grab it on her way out. The house seemed to breathe with her, a faint rhythm that matched footfalls and familiar tasks. She turned off lights one by one and left the porch lamp on for a moment before flicking it dark. A last look down the hallway, a small prayer for her students and for the week ahead. Then the bed took her weight and the room quieted. Outside, dew began to gather on the white Honda's windshield. Inside, the green charge light pulsed on the counter and the key on the hook did not move. A locked door can keep secrets that begin without a sound. Sunday began the way Sundays always did in Ocilla, bells and quiet roads and familiar pews. One space stayed empty. Tara's friends looked for her in the aisle where she always walked in with a small wave and a lesson on her mind. A call was placed, then another, then 15 in a row that slipped to voicemail. Texts stacked beside missed calls, a chorus with no reply. The small discomfort that comes with a late arrival turned into a weight that settled on everyone who loved her. Maria. Woods left the church with a knot in her chest and drove straight to West Highway 319. Tara's white Honda sat in the driveway just as she had left it, beads of dew clinging to the windshield. The calm picture of an ordinary morning that did not feel ordinary at all. Maria stepped out, tried the front door, and found the lock firm beneath her hand. She called Tara's name through the wood, listened for a response that did not come, and walked the path to the back. Windows looked back at her with their own stillness. One curtain moved slightly in the light breeze from a cracked bedroom window. Maria cupped her hands to the kitchen glass and peered inside. On the counter, a pink case lay around a phone that rested on its charger, the small green light steady as if it had been waiting. Tara never went anywhere without that phone. Seeing it there made the quiet inside the house feel louder. She circled again, searching for a sign that would explain away the tightness in her throat. No broken screen, no scattered mail, no tipped chair. A normal house holding something that refused normal explanation. She called friends from the porch, asked if anyone had heard from Tara, and listened as the same answer came back again and again. No word, no sign. By midday, the worry had shifted from uneasy to sharp. Maria stood at the kitchen window one more time and tried to map a reasonable story onto what she saw. The purse would be inside. The keys would be on their hook. The lesson plans would be ready for Monday morning. All of it fit the woman she knew, and none of it fit the silence. She pressed her forehead to the glass and looked at the small glow of the charging phone as if it could explain itself. The sun lifted higher, and the neighborhood stayed still. A locked door held its line. A car did not move. Friends gathered at the edge of the yard with careful voices, each one hoping the others had good news to cancel the ache they felt. No one did. The feeling that had started as concern now took on a new name, the kind that makes the air feel heavy and the clock feel slow. Someone reached for a phone with a different purpose, the kind of call that begins reports and timelines and entry logs. The kind of call that brings a knock to a quiet house. Monday morning moved like it always did at Irwin County High School, until it did not. Tara's classroom door stayed locked, lights off, lesson plans unseen. Students gathered in the hallway with the restless energy that comes when the routine slips. The principal walked the corridor with a phone pressed to his ear, calling every number on her sheet, each ring adding weight to a worry that had started yesterday and now would not let go. By mid-morning, the calls had turned into a request for a welfare check, and a patrol car rolled toward West Highway 319, while a substitute held a stack of attendance slips and tried to quiet a room that felt wrong without its teacher. At the house, officers knocked, called her name, and announced their presence. The door held firm. Authorization came, the lock gave, and the quiet inside moved out into the yard like a breath. The kitchen greeted them first, a purse on the counter with the wallet inside, keys on the hook by the door, a phone on its charger, with a steady glow that felt out of place in the daylight. Nothing scattered, nothing broken, nothing that raised a voice and demanded attention. They moved down the hall to the bedroom. The bed was unmade in a way that offered no certainty. It could have been the sign of an early start or a late collapse, nothing more. The desk held printed lesson plans set in neat piles. Papers were clipped and ready. A schedule waited for a teacher who had not arrived to claim it. The officers took careful steps, noting what existed and what did not, building a picture from small, quiet facts. At the back of the room, a detail stood out. The bedroom window was unlocked. The screen sat askew in its frame, not torn, not crushed, just wrong enough to be noticed. Outside, beneath the sill, the ground showed softened impressions, not clear enough to read like words, but not nothing. Rain from the previous week had blurred whatever story the dirt might have told. It left behind only the suggestion of movement and the question of direction. They expanded the search through each room, taking photographs, logging positions, and marking items that might matter later. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no stain that spoke louder than the rest of the house. The scene offered almost nothing, and yet it refused to feel ordinary. The intact purse and keys, the undisturbed rooms, the open path through, a window that might have been a habit or might have been a door. When they stepped back onto the porch, the white Honda still rested where it had been left, a constant in a morning that was quickly losing shape. Reports began to fill with times and details, names and observations, lines that would start a file too large for one binder. The school called again asking for news. Friends waited together with arms folded tight across their chests, looking from the car to the house to the officers and back again. A window that is open to the night can be an answer or a trap, and the land beyond it can hide more than it shows. By Tuesday morning, the case no longer belonged only to friends and neighbors. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation rolled in with maps, radios, and a plan that turned the courthouse parking lot into a command post. A folding table became a sign-in station. Clipboards filled with grid assignments. A whiteboard carried time, zones, and the growing list of names willing to help. Teachers stood beside farmers. Former students pinned on volunteer tags. Church groups stacked bottled water and sandwiches, beside stacks of freshly printed flyers that showed Tara's kind smile above the word missing. Deputies marked sectors on county maps, drawing careful lines across pine stands, fields, and dirt roads. Teams formed and moved out. Some walked shoulder to shoulder through tall grass, pushing aside brush with sticks and careful hands. Others launched small boats into slow water and scanned banks that twisted under overhanging limbs. Riders on horseback took to fence lines and pecan rows, eyes sweeping for anything that did not belong. Cadaver dogs worked methodically, handlers reading every change in posture, every hesitation. Helicopters circled above the patchwork of farms and woods, their thrum a steady reminder that the search had become larger than a neighborhood concern. Barns were opened, hunting cabins were checked. Drainage ditches were cleared of branches and debris. Crews paused to study a scrap of fabric or a footprint that seemed fresh until the soil told a different story. Radios crackled with updates that sounded hopeful until they did not. Each promising lead faded into another entry on the whiteboard, erased and replaced by the next set of coordinates. As the sun slipped low, teams returned dusty and quiet. The command post looked the same, but felt heavier. Flyers were gone from the table and now hung in store windows, at gas pumps, and on church doors in every direction. The whiteboard showed more ground covered than anyone thought possible in a single day, yet the space next to confirmed remained empty. The land had given no answers. When the searchers finally stepped back, a different kind of movement began. The kind that starts with a question asked in a grocery line and spreads faster than any river current. When the search lines pulled back, talk rushed in to fill the empty space. At the diner, a booth near the windows carried theories about a break in gone wrong. At the gas pumps, someone spoke softly about an old relationship and whether hurt feelings can turn into something darker. Names were mentioned in careful tones, then folded away when a neighbor stepped closer. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath while trying to read one another's eyes. The Ocilla Gazette ran bold type that asked, "Where is our teacher?" The second day, the headline sharpened and promised new information. By the end of the week, news vans rolled past the courthouse and parked by the school sign. Reporters filmed stand-ups in the morning light, then again at dusk. A segment opened on a national evening show. America's Most Wanted teased the mystery of a teacher who vanished between a pageant and a Sunday service. Camera crews caught the high school facade, the church steps, the quiet stretch of West Highway 319, and the pecan trees that wait at the edge of so many fields. With each story, more eyes turned toward Ocilla. Tara's sister stood beside friends and asked anyone watching to look closely at the flyer, to check old photos, to search memory for a detail that might matter. Former students described a teacher who pushed them to believe in themselves. Pastors spoke about hope that endures through long nights. The reward total climbed and the phone lines lit again. Tips arrived in a blur. A car seen near a mailbox after midnight. A stranger asking questions at a store. A tale from a distant county that sounded promising until the details collapsed. Detectives logged every call, stacked every note and retraced steps. The pile grew. The map pins multiplied. The pattern refused to form. Days turned into a loop of press briefings and quiet follow-ups. The story traveled far, then circled back home with nothing in its hands. People tried to live their lives without letting go of the thread. They put up new flyers where the wind had taken the old ones. They kept their porch lights on a little longer. They lowered their voices when they passed the white Honda in the driveway. Cameras do not stay forever. When they drifted away to the next story, the town stood in the same stillness and the case moved from bright lights to a stack of files and a waiting microphone at a government podium. A message was coming that would change the pace from loud to very quiet. Weeks passed and the whiteboard at the command post filled, then wiped clean, then filled again. Leads were logged, checked, and set aside. The routine became steady and heavy. Phone calls in the morning, field checks in the afternoon, notes typed late into the night. When reporters asked for progress, the answer grew careful. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation stepped up to a podium and said there were no solid leads at this time. The promise was firm. The work would not stop. The room heard the words and felt the meaning beneath them. The trail was cold. The huge search lines faded into smaller teams. Maps stayed open, but the markers moved less often. The investigation slid from boots and brush to binders and screens. Cell records were read. Bank activity was reviewed. Old interviews were played and replayed, each pause measured, each timeline tightened. Detectives built a careful record that could hold weight in court, if only something would connect. The town learned a new kind of waiting. It was not the waiting at the edge of a field. It was the waiting in kitchens, in church halls, in the quiet between errands. December brought cold air and soft light. Candles were passed from hand to hand in the high school parking lot, where search teams had once gathered at dawn. The first memorial vigil took shape without rehearsal. People arrived with heavy coats and small flames that turned faces gold. A pastor prayed for strength. Former students spoke about how Tara made hard days easier. A colleague remembered how she stayed late to help a shy junior practice a presentation until her voice found its level. Her sister stood near the front and held a photograph that showed a smile no weather could dim. No one spoke in headlines. They spoke in first names and small stories. A borrowed dress pinned at the shoulder. A college essay revised 3 times until the sentences finally fit. A quiet rescue in a hallway when someone thought about quitting and she would not let it happen. The wind tugged at the programs. The candles flickered and steadied. When the final prayer ended, the crowd lingered. Strangers hugged. Old classmates promised to keep posting the flyer. People carried home a circle of light and tried to keep it from going out. The next morning, the binders were still there, full of dates and transcripts and unanswered spaces. The phone lines were still open. The porch light stayed on a little later. The town had shifted from sprint to endurance, from shouting into the woods to holding a candle high enough for someone to see. Each October would return like a marker on a long road, and the circle around the candles would begin to change. October returned like a slow turning page, and with it came the same gathering in the high school lot, the same candles, the same hymn that people could sing without looking down. The first year felt like a promise that answers would come if everyone held on tightly enough. The second year felt like a test of endurance. By the third and fourth, the circle of light had grown smaller, but the faces inside it were steady. The reward total climbed as neighbors added what they could. A jar on a counter in a feed store. A collection at a church supper. A quiet check pressed into a family member's hand with a nod that said, "Keep going." Newspapers still wrote the anniversary story, but the headline moved from the front page to the inside fold. A camera crew came one year, then not the next. Reporters rotated to other beats. The town did not blame them. It was hard to write the same question over and over when the answer refused to show itself. What did not shrink were the files. The binders multiplied. Each one wore a label with dates and initials and the kind of shorthand that tells investigators where to look when sleep is thin and time is tight. Interviews were transcribed and cross-referenced. Phone records were charted and taped into timelines that ran the length of a conference table. Attendance at the vigils thinned, not out of indifference, but because life keeps pulling people in a dozen directions, even when the heart wants to stay in one place. Still, the core remained. A sister who would not stop speaking her name, former students who now carried their own children on their hips and told them about the teacher who made them brave, a pastor who kept the prayer on the list every Sunday as steady as sunrise. Hope changed shape. It stopped shouting. It learned to whisper and keep breathing. The school installed a small brass plaque beside a classroom door. It was not a shrine. It was a reminder that the work she loved kept going. Teachers paused by it on busy mornings and pressed a palm to the metal like a quiet promise. The hallway carried new voices and the past settled into the space between bells. The white Honda left the driveway long ago, but the image of that morning stayed in the town's memory the way an old photograph stays in a family album. Clear at first glance, heavier when you linger. Through it all, the file drawers grew heavier and the reward line inched upward, while the candle circle held on through wind and rain and the slow erosion of certainty. People asked the same question less loudly, but they still asked it when the road was empty and the radio was off. They waited for anything strong enough to move the needle after so many years of careful work and careful hope. New voice was about to cut through, the quiet, and carry her name farther than any flyer ever could. Years after the first flyers curled on store windows, a different kind of searchlight switched on. A podcaster drove the same quiet roads that volunteers had walked, carrying microphones and curiosity instead of maps and stakes. Up and Vanished began to speak Tara's name into rooms far from Ocilla, and people who had never heard of Irwin County leaned closer to listen. Episodes unfolded with steady care. Former students sat for interviews and described a teacher who made them stand taller. Colleagues shared staff room memories and the ache of an empty classroom that stayed locked too long. Investigators explained procedures and timelines, careful with details but open about the weight of a case that would not let go. The show did something that daily headlines could not do anymore. It slowed down and made space for voices. Listeners heard the rhythm of real people telling what they saw, what they felt, and what they still wondered. With each episode, the audience grew. Screens lit up from Savannah to Seattle as new ears joined the circle that had once been just a handful of candles in a school parking lot. The case climbed the podcast charts, and with that visibility came energy that felt fresh, like air moving through a room that had been closed too long. Tips began to return, not in a trickle but in a steady flow. Old memories were jogged by a name mentioned in passing. A photograph surfaced from a long, unopened box. A line from a story told years ago suddenly seemed important. The GBI phones, quiet for stretches of time, started to ring again. Some leads faded under scrutiny, as so many had before, but others asked investigators to revisit locations and people with new questions and a sharper lens. Online, strangers formed groups and compared notes with respect for the family and for the work still underway. They mapped timelines, marked distances, and shared news clips that many in Ocilla had not seen since the first week. A crowd that once gathered in one county now lived on message boards and social feeds across the country. The tone was serious, patient, and focused on the only goal that mattered, finding the truth that had stayed just out of reach. National media noticed the swell and returned to the story with renewed attention. Producers called for background. Segment editors requested audio. The teacher from a small Georgia town was back on screens and in headlines, not as a recycled anniversary brief, but as a living investigation with forward motion. The effect inside Ocilla was cautious hope. People kept their voices low when they talked about it at church or over coffee, but they could feel the shift. It was the sensation of a heavy object that finally budges after many hands have tried to move it. The momentum did not replace careful police work, but it gave that work more light and more eyes. Interviews were scheduled with new care. Old statements were pulled and compared again. The podcast had become a second wind, and the case began to lean toward a line that had not been crossed since the earliest days. The line where silence breaks and someone speaks. The shift began with a ring that did not sound like any other call. An investigator at a desk in Atlanta picked up, heard the urgency in a local officer's voice, and felt the old road to Ocilla rise up again. For 11 years they had driven that road for leads that thinned out before they reached the courthouse. This time the words were different. "We have something. Bring what you need." The room they used for routine interviews looked the same as it always did. A table, 2 chairs, a recorder, a stack of standard questions. Ryan Duke sat across from detectives who had been asking about small crimes and familiar names. The kind of conversation that usually ends with a thank you and a door closing. Instead, a sentence landed like iron. He said he went to Tara's house. He said he broke in to take things. He said she woke and fear took control. He said he struck her. The air in the room changed shape and the questions changed with it. He did not stop there. He named Bo Dukes as the person he called when panic erased judgment and left only the need to hide what had been done. He described a plan that did not feel like a plan, a frantic chain of choices that led away from the small house on West Highway 319 and toward a stand of pecan trees on land Bo's family knew well. Fire was mentioned. A place between 2 trees was mentioned. Items that might have been carried and destroyed were mentioned. The recorder took down every word, every pause, every detail that could later be checked against the ground itself. Detectives stepped out into the hallway, faces set in the look that comes when a long-held breath finally leaves the body. Calls were made. A map was pulled. A team was assembled to follow a path that had been hidden behind years of rumor and guesswork. The chance to match a spoken story to soil and ash was suddenly real. A confession can open a door, but the earth has to agree. They followed a narrow farm road that cut through rows of pecan trees, each trunk straight as a rule, each branch making a lattice of shade on the ground. Ryan walked ahead with a halting certainty, the kind that comes from replaying the same steps in the mind for years. He stopped between 2 larger trees that framed a shallow clearing and lifted a hand toward a patch of earth that looked no different from any other at first glance. The team took in the symmetry of the grove, the neat geometry around a place that was not neat at all. Markers went down. Photographs were taken from every angle. Technicians knelt and began to work the soil in careful layers, lifting small samples into labeled bags. The ground told a story in hushed detail. There were signs of extreme heat at that spot, a pattern in the soil that did not match normal field burn. There were chemical hints of an accelerant, faint and weathered by seasons of rain, but present enough to draw attention. Screens rattled softly as sifted earth revealed tiny fragments that would travel to a lab with all the caution that years of waiting had taught. No one spoke much. The orchard held its own quiet, broken only by the scrape of tools and the low murmur of instructions. Investigators moved methodically, mapping out the circle of disturbance, measuring distances to trunks and furrows, recording how the ground changed from soft loam to the darker, glassy texture that heat can leave behind. Each small finding built a bridge between words in a confession room and facts underfoot. Relief flickered at the edges of the scene. After so many false turns, here was a location that matched a description, a point on the map that could be tested against science. With it came a feeling that pressed just as hard. Revulsion at the thought of fire used as eraser. Grief at how close this place had always been to the town that searched rivers and woods, while these straight rows stood still and said nothing. The answer had been inside the map the entire time. The land belonged to a family that had watched harvests and holidays under these same branches. That knowledge settled over the team like an extra weight. This was not a remote hideaway. It was familiar ground, used and loved, repurposed for something that would stain every memory attached to it. The orchard did not change shape, but it felt different now. like a photograph that means one thing until someone tells you what was just outside the frame. Bags were sealed. Coordinates were logged. The clearing was left as intact as possible for whatever courts would require. When the team stood and looked back down the row, the distance to Ocilla felt impossibly short. The drive would take minutes. The years had taken so much longer. Word would travel from this quiet field to church pews and kitchen tables, and people would have to decide how to carry the knowledge that the final path led through a place so many had known since childhood. News from the orchard moved faster than any broadcast, crossing porches and pews by word of mouth, carrying a weight that settled on every kitchen table in Ocilla. People had searched swamp edges and fence lines for years, and now the story pointed back to familiar faces, former students, boys who had once sat in rows beneath fluorescent lights and listened to the same teacher everyone was trying to honor. The hurt did not arrive as anger first. It arrived as disbelief, then a quiet that felt heavier than shouting. On Sunday, the sanctuary filled with a silence that made every cough sound loud. Pastor Eddie Wilder stood with the prayer list in his hands and named what no one wanted to speak aloud. For 12 years, the line beside Tara's name had asked for safe return. That line now asked for justice and for mercy, for strength to stand under answers that burned as they clarified. Heads bowed. Mothers wiped tears they had been holding since the first vigil. Fathers stared down at the carpet and tried to understand how a secret could live so close without being seen. Across town, families found themselves on different sides of the same dinner table. Some had known the Duke's family since childhood, had shared holidays and harvests, and could not reconcile those memories with the words they were reading. Others felt the snap of betrayal and wanted every page of the case laid bare. Conversations turned careful. Long friendships spent under the strain of what to believe and how to speak about boys who were no longer boys. At coffee counters and feed stores, the talk was muted but steady. People reviewed what they remembered from the fall of 2005, who was where, who said what, who seemed nervous, who avoided the subject. Theories that once pointed outward now circled back toward the center. Law and loyalty met in uneasy company, and the town learned how complicated it feels when justice asks you to look at someone you grew up with and see more than one truth at once. Schools felt it too. Hallways carried a new hush when the plaque beside a classroom door caught the light. Teachers kept moving with lesson plans and attendance sheets, but each bell seemed to ring with a second meaning. Students who had only heard the case through parents and podcasts now saw it take shape in real time. Not as a legend, but as a series of choices and consequences connected to names they recognized. Prayer chains that once asked for open doors and safe paths began to include the families of the accused, and that choice did not sit easily with everyone. Still, the lists grew to hold all the lives touched by the same night and the long years that followed. Mercy and accountability did not cancel each other. They pulled in opposite directions and asked the town to keep its balance. The courthouse steps became a place where reporters gathered again, where short answers met long questions, where every official statement sounded both resolute and weary. People stood at the edge of the sidewalk and listened without nodding, then went home to the same undecided conversations. Ocilla was not a place that turned away from its own. It was a place that kept showing up, even when showing up meant sitting in a pew beside someone whose last name now lived inside a headline. Under the pecan branches, evidence bags had closed and coordinates had been logged. In living rooms and sanctuaries, something remained open, something that could not be sealed with tape and a label. A community had to decide how to carry truth that hurt and how to keep faith with the woman whose life had shaped so many others. A courtroom door was about to swing on its hinges and fix the first measure of responsibility in black and white. The courthouse air felt heavy, the kind that makes every bench creak sound like it matters. Bo Dukes sat at the defense table with hands folded while the judge reviewed the charges that had lived in files and headlines for years. Concealing a death, hindering the apprehension of a criminal, tampering with evidence. The words were plain and cold, and they described actions that had kept a family in darkness and a town on edge for more than a decade. Faces in the gallery told the timeline without speaking. Former students, now older, a sister holding steady, neighbors who had walked fence lines and prayed through long winters. The prosecutor laid out the path that began after a night of panic and ran straight through a pecan orchard where silence and fire did their work. There were chances to come forward. There were years to tell the truth. Each missed chance had a cost that could not be measured only in pages and exhibits. When the sentence came, it came without flourish. 25 years in state custody, a single line that landed with the weight of a full chapter closing. No one applauded. The room breathed and listened as the judge spoke about duty and delay, about a community that had carried pain while an answer sat close enough to touch. The message was simple. The law would set an anchor, even if it could not repair what time and choices had taken. Bo Dukes was led away, and the door at the side of the room opened and closed with a final sound that everyone felt. It was the first firm consequence written into the record. The first time the system had pressed a mark beside the case and said, "This part is settled." People filed out slowly into a bright afternoon that did not match their faces. Some stood on the steps and stared at the sidewalk as if words might gather there. Others moved straight to their cars and drove home along the same streets that had carried them to vigils and search briefings and church services for so many years. The family did not use big statements. They used steadiness. They held to the truth that accountability matters and that one sentence does not end a story that still needs answers about intent and responsibility for the night that began everything. The town felt two feelings at once: relief that something real had finally happened, and the stubborn ache of the larger question that still waited. One verdict down, the heavier trial still ahead where a jury would be asked to weigh confession, memory, and the thin line between panic and purpose. After the first sentence against Bo Dukes, the calendar seemed ready to finally carry everyone to the larger reckoning. Instead, the hallway outside the courtroom filled with filings and arguments that tested patience more than any long search through woods ever had. Defense papers challenged the confession at the center of the case, line by line, word by word. They argued about how tired a person was, about what substances blur judgment, about who asked which question and how a pause can bend meaning. Prosecutors answered with transcripts and timelines, with the steady claim that what was said in that small room matched what the soil had quietly held. Each side stacked pages like sandbags, and the stack rose higher than anyone expected. Then the world itself shifted. Court schedules broke apart as a pandemic crossed every border and settled into every plan. Jury pools could not gather. Witness travel froze. Hearing dates slipped across the calendar like rain-moving chalk lines down a driveway. Masks and distance rules turned quick appearances into months of waiting, and months into a year that refused to let a gavel fall. Families watched new numbers on nightly news while keeping their eyes on old case numbers that did not move. For Tara's sister, endurance took a different shape now. No trail to walk. No flyer to hang. Only the slow grind of continuance orders delivered in official language that never once said what it felt like. She kept every notice in a thin folder that did not feel thin anymore. Each postponement carried a reason that made sense on paper, and made no sense to a heart that had been ready for a verdict since long before the world changed. Friends checked in with soft voices and careful questions. The town kept faith with small gestures that mattered. A meal left on a porch. A message sent on court days that dissolved into weeks. Inside the legal maze, smaller hearings did happen, often on screens where faces looked flat and tired. Experts argued about wording and memory, about whether a person can be walked toward an answer, about whether a detail could have been fed or found. The judge measured each claim and set new dates that felt close enough to touch until they slid away again. The case did not stall because anyone stopped caring. It stalled because everything did, and because the defense had one job and would press it to the very edge. By the start of 2022, the file was heavier, the family was quieter, and the county understood a different level of patience. The question was no longer only what happened on that October weekend. It was whether 12 people could be seated who had heard the story for years and still promised to listen as if it were new. Spring brought people back to the courthouse steps with careful hope and guarded faces. Before any testimony could be heard, the long work of finding a jury began. It proved harder than almost anything that had come before. Nearly everyone in Irwin County knew the outlines of the case. Many had walked search lines, shared flyers, or prayed by candlelight. Potential jurors sat under oath and answered plain questions with complicated histories behind them. Had they listened to the podcast? Had they seen the news reports? Had a family member joined the searches? Hands rose often. The judge and the attorneys pressed on day after day, looking for 12 people who could set aside years of story and promise to weigh only what would be said in that room. When a panel was finally seated, the prosecution stood and built a clear, steady path for the jury to walk. The state said this was a burglary that spiraled into violence when Tara woke and fear took over. The state said the window in the MS-seated screen mattered. The state said a confession in a quiet room matched the disturbed soil in a pecan orchard and the pattern of a fire that should never have been lit. The state said that after a fatal act, there was concealment, and that choice stretched a single night into 17 years of loss. The defense rose and redrew the map. They said the confession could not be trusted. They said fatigue, substances, and pressure can bend memory and coax words that fit a theory rather than the truth. They asked the jury to look for hard proof that was not there. No fingerprints that tied a hand to a knob. No DNA that tied a body to a room. No camera that caught a face at a window. They pointed to gaps and asked if those gaps were empty by chance or by uncertainty. That should matter at the highest standard of proof. Opening statements framed two opposing pictures. In one, a break-in turned fatal and two young men chose to hide what they had done beneath pecan branches and years of silence. In the other, a desperate investigation leaned too hard on a tired man in a small room and let a second man shift blame from his own shoulders. The jury listened, pens moved across small notebooks, and the judge reminded everyone that evidence, not history, would decide the law. Inside the gallery, Tara's family sat in their usual place close together, faces set with the kind of focus that comes from waiting too long to afford any drift. On the other side, defense supporters kept their eyes forward, bracing against a tide that had already moved once through their homes and churches. The air carried that courthouse mix of paper, polish, and tension. Each side believed the law would prove their story. Each side believed the other was shaping pieces that did not fit. As witnesses lined up in the hallway and the first subpoenaed names were called, the room leaned toward the rail to hear how memories, maps, and lab reports would hold under oath. A single voice can change how a jury sees a timeline. The state began with structure. A Georgia Bureau of Investigation agent unrolled the timeline like a map, hour by hour from the pageant night to the first welfare check, then year by year through searches, interviews, and the orchard discovery. Phone records were shown as simple lines that rose and fell. Bank statements were placed where they belonged. The classroom plans printed for Monday sat in a photo on the screen, a quiet reminder that life had been ready to keep going. The jury followed with pens, drawing small arrows, circling gaps that the agent acknowledged with steady care. Former classmates took the stand and added human corners to the chart. They spoke about hallways and parties and how a man's name would make conversation shift. They remembered glances away when Tara was mentioned. They remembered stretches of silence that felt too heavy for ordinary discomfort. None of it was a direct line. All of it was mood, behavior, a sense that certain topics made the air dense. The defense pressed them on memory. How sure were they after so many years? Could a nervous look mean anything at all? The witnesses held to what they felt at the time, and the jury wrote again. Then came the voice from prison. Bo Dukes was brought in through recording and sworn testimony, wearing the years he had already been sentenced to carry. He described a late call that sent him into panic. A drive, a body, and a fire in a clearing between two pecan trees. He named accelerant. He named tools. He drew the circle on the ground that matched the disturbance investigators had later mapped. The room listened without movement. The defense stepped forward and aimed at credibility. They asked what he stood to gain by shaping his story. They asked why the truth had waited for so long if truth was what he was offering now. Bo's answers held, but each one carried the shadow of his own conviction. Experts followed with the language of labs and standards. Soil samples were described by layers and signatures of heat. There were chemical traces that pointed toward accelerant, but weather had washed, diluted, and stretched them thin. No direct DNA survived years of rain and sun. No bone fragment could be proven beyond any doubt to be human. The state argued that absence did not undo the pattern. The defense argued that absence mattered most in a case built on words. Charts and photos gave the jury things to see, but they also showed the limits of what the earth was willing to keep. Conflicting memories surfaced as earlier interviews were read back to witnesses. A time changed by an hour. A location shifted by a street. A phrase remembered as certain now sounded less fixed under oath. The prosecution said that memory frays at the edges but holds its center. The defense said the edges are where reasonable doubt lives. The judge reminded everyone that the standard is high for a reason, and the panel kept taking notes. Through every hour, the gallery carried its own weight. Tara's sister sat with a photograph tucked in her bag and her hands folded tight. Friends fixed their gaze on the witness box, flinching when the orchard was described, breathing carefully when the classroom was mentioned. Across the aisle, mothers and fathers of the accused held still and stared forward, learning how to stand in a place where loyalty and law meet without a script for how to feel. The sound of chairs sliding, the soft cough, the measured footsteps to and from the stand, all of it pressed into the room's memory alongside exhibits and transcripts. By the time the court recessed each day, the jurors looked like people who had carried boxes up a long stair. Facts weighed one way and then another. Stories overlapped and then pulled apart. Everyone understood what the verdict would mean, not just on paper but in kitchens and pews and the quiet stretch of West. Highway 319, where a porch light had once burned a little longer. A single set of arguments remained to frame everything the jury had heard and to draw the line between fear and intent, between gaps and certainty. Closing arguments pulled the room tight. The defense stood first and walked the jury back through every gap, every blurred edge of memory, every place where the record did not carry hard proof. They pressed the idea that words spoken in a small room can bend under pressure, that a tired mind can be led, that a man already in prison can shape a story to his advantage. Reasonable doubt was the drumbeat. No fingerprints that fix a hand to a knob. No DNA that ties a body to a room. No camera that sees a face at a window. The law asks for certainty, they said, and certainty is not here. The prosecution answered by laying the pieces in a single line. A nighttime entry that began as theft. A confrontation that turned violent. A call to a friend. A clearing beneath pecan branches. Soil that remembered heat and accelerant long after rain tried to wash the story away. They reminded the jurors that evidence can be a pattern as well as a single mark. That a confession described a place that testing later marked in the ground. And that concealment stretched one choice into years of harm felt by a family in a town. The judge charged the jury. The panel filed out with the quiet tread of people carrying a heavy object together. Hours later, they returned and the room rose. The foreperson held the paper that would draw a line through 17 years. On the charge of malice murder, not guilty. On the charge of felony murder, guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. On the charge of burglary, guilty. On the charge of concealing the death of another, guilty. A difference settled over the room, not relief and not shock, but the sober recognition that intent and outcome had been weighed separately and did not always land in the same place. Faces in the gallery showed the mix that only long cases create. Tara's family held each other and breathed through the moment with the steadiness they had trained for across seasons of waiting. Supporters of the defendant stared forward, taking in a verdict that spared one word and fixed others that would not move. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set the calendar for sentencing. Lawyers gathered papers with the slow care of people whose work is not finished even when a decision has been reached. The doors opened and the hallway filled with the soft shuffle of shoes and the low hum of reporters phoning in the shape of the day. Outside, the courthouse steps felt the weight of many years and many prayers, and the town stood in the late light with a question that had lived in every kitchen and pew since October of 2005. What measure of punishment would finally be written on the record to match the harm that could never be undone? The courtroom was full before the clock reached the hour. Papers were stacked square on counsel tables. The judge entered and everyone rose, the air holding that stillness that settles just before a decision is spoken. Ryan Duke stood, thinner than the photograph most people remembered, eyes fixed on a point beyond the bench. The judge read through the record, the counts already decided by the jury, and then set the line that would not move. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no noise, only a collective breath that left the room at once. The words did what they could do. They marked the law's answer and placed it where everyone could see it. The judge spoke about harm that rippled from a single night through years of grief and suspicion, about a community that searched and waited and refused to forget, about a family that had carried patience farther than anyone should be asked to carry it. The bench did not claim to heal what had been broken. It fixed accountability to a name and a sentence that would outlast seasons and headlines. Ryan Duke listened without reaction while his attorneys rested hands on his shoulders. A brief touch that said their part of the road had narrowed to a single lane. Deputies stepped close. Steel met wrist. A door at the side opened and closed, and he was gone from sight. The echo of the latch, the only sound that followed him down the hall. Across another set of miles, Bo Dukes remained in his own cell, serving the years assigned to him for the fire and the long silence that followed. 2 former students had reached an end that looked like concrete and keys and routine counts. An end that shadowed families who never chose to be part of this story. At the front row, Tara's sister stood when the judge finished and faced the microphones outside because that is what this journey had trained her to do. Justice has been served, she said in steady words that did not pretend to be triumphant. Nothing returns birthdays or lesson plans or the warmth of a teacher's laugh in a hallway. Nothing returns the life that set so many others in motion. But the law had answered, and that answer would stand. Reporters wrote as quickly as they could while townspeople listened with arms crossed tight, heads bowed, or eyes fixed on the courthouse steps as if the bricks themselves could hold the weight of the day. People drifted away in small groups. Some spoke about the strange quiet that follows a long storm. Others said they felt the first real exhale in years. A few admitted they felt only the ache of finality, the confirmation that nothing would ever feel the same again. Teachers returned to classrooms that afternoon and set out fresh copies for a new unit. Parents made dinner and checked homework and paused at kitchen windows for just a moment longer than usual. In 100 small ways, the town tried to settle into a version of peace that did not ask anyone to forget. The case file did not close its cover. It shifted from pursuit to memory, from urgent calls to careful keeping. The hallway at the high school still carried a plaque that caught the light and reminded everyone that the story began with a woman who believed in young people and who taught them to stand straight under pressure. The final judgment ensured the men responsible would never walk free. It did not restore a life or lighten a family's empty chair. It did not repair trust all at once. It told the truth as the law could tell it, and it left the community to finish the harder work of living with both justice and loss. When October returned, the auditorium lights would rise again, and the town would choose how to remember a teacher whose influence kept moving, even when her footsteps had stopped. On a mild October evening, the Irwin County High School auditorium filled again, not with pageant nerves and bright stage lights, but with steady faces and careful breaths. 17 years had passed since the last ordinary night, and the town gathered to mark what could finally be named without hesitation. Programs rested on laps with Tara's photograph on the cover, a soft halo of light around a familiar smile. Students who once stood beside her were now parents guiding their own children to seats near the aisle. Teachers who had shared break rooms and lesson plans took the front rows with hands folded, ready to honor a colleague whose desk would never hold another stack of graded papers. The principal stepped to the microphone and spoke about a life that lifted others. Not a headline, not a mystery, but a teacher who found potential in shy voices and turned it into steady speech. Former contestants from the Sweet Potato Festival pageant came forward one by one. They remembered shoes taped for grip, hairpins counted out in little cups, and the calm coaching that made a stage feel less like a cliff. Each story was small on its own, and together they sounded like a chorus that filled the room without the need for music. Candles were not the center anymore. Tonight was not a vigil against the dark. Tonight was remembrance that made space for both sorrow and gratitude. A choir of students and alumni sang a hymn that did not ask for answers, but offered comfort that felt earned. The pastor read lines about endurance and peace, then stepped aside so the people who knew her best could carry the moment forward. A guidance counselor shared how Tara stayed late to help a senior rewrite a scholarship essay, until the words finally found the right order. A custodian recalled quick conversations in quiet hallways that left him smiling through the rest of a long shift. A former student held up a dog-eared note Tara once wrote on a quiz, 4 sentences that turned a struggling learner into a college graduate. When Marie rose, the room stilled, as if the building itself knew to listen. She spoke without rush or flourish. She thanked the town for holding her family through years that felt longer than years should feel. She thanked the investigators who kept files open, and the volunteers who kept hope warm on cold mornings. She described a sister who loved birthdays, who called on Sundays, who believed that small kindness can change the shape of a whole week. Justice had done what justice can do, she said. But justice does not return a voice, a laugh, a seat at the table. What remains is the work of carrying her light in the places she loved. Marie asked every person in the room to honor Tara by noticing the student who sits alone, by applauding a small victory, by telling the truth with courage and care. The audience stood as one, not for spectacle, but because standing felt like the right way to hold the weight of gratitude. People filed out slowly past the auditorium doors where the first flyers had once been taped. Outside, the October air carried the mixed scent of fallen leaves and fresh hope. Porch lights would still shine a little longer in many homes, not out of fear now, but as a habit of remembrance. The plaque in the hallway would continue to catch late afternoon sun and turn it into a quiet invitation to teach with patience and to lead with kindness. Across Ocilla, life moved on with a new kind of peace. The case had an ending that the law could write, and the community had a beginning that memory could keep. A classroom stayed full of voices, a stage kept lifting new names, and a sister's steady words settled into the town like roots that hold through every season. There is one more truth to set beside the memorial glow, a final thought about what answers can give and what they can never replace. The search is over. The files sit closed on their shelves. A sentence has been spoken and the doors have locked behind the men who carried this secret. Answers arrived, and with them came consequence instead of comfort. That is the shape of the ending in Ocilla. Not a cheer, not relief that erases loss, only truth set down where everyone can see it, and a space at the table that will never fill again. What remains is a teacher's echo in the places she loved. A hallway plaque that catches afternoon light. A student who stands taller because someone once believed she could. A pageant stage where a crown glints and a coach's words still guide careful steps. A sister who kept faith through years that felt longer than years should feel. Now able to sleep without wondering where the trail might lead. A town that refused to forget, that learned how to hold each other when suspicion pressed hard and hope grew thin, that chose remembrance over rumor and steady work over noise. The orchard is only rows of trees again. The house on West Highway 319 belongs to new routines. The high school keeps ringing its bells. Life has moved forward, but not away. Memory sits quietly in ordinary places. A classroom door, a church pew, a kitchen window at dusk. Every one of them holds a small lantern for Tara Grinstead, not as a mystery now, but as a life that lifted others and deserved the safety that every teacher should have. Justice did what it could. It measured acts and named them. It fixed responsibility. It did not mend a mother's heart or return years that were stolen. That is the hard truth and the honest ending. Even so, the story leaves a charge that feels simple and strong. Look for the student who needs a hand. Applaud loudly when someone finds courage. Tell the truth the first time, even when it costs. Carry the light forward, because someone once carried it for you. If you are still here with me, if you watched to this final line, it means this story earned your like and your subscribe for unscripted tales. Please turn on the bell icon so you do not miss the next case we tell with care. Help us complete 5,000 likes on this story. That is the target my mother set for you, and it costs nothing. Tell me from which city you are watching, and let the comments become a book of memory for Tara, and for every small town that refuses to let a good life be forgotten.